Good evening and welcome to another Everybody Hates Cleveland podcast. I'm your host, Jim Pete, joined by my partner in crime, Michael Hattery. Tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about the Cleveland Indians rotation, jumping into Cleveland Indians baseball, less than 10 days away from pitchers and catchers reporting to Goodyear. Most of them actually are already there. But with the Indians, it's pretty much Indians Eve, Mike. It's about time we leave the Browns behind. Let's leave them in the dust, leave them in the lurch. We'll have plenty to talk about come June, come May, come draft day. Don't you think it's time we start focusing on what could end up being the best team in Cleveland, your Cleveland Indians? How excited are you for the season?
I just outlandishly excited, just really irritatingly optimistic about this team. It's just I can't imagine the offseason working out better for the Indians. I don't think it plays out in a better way in terms of what happened to the other teams in the division. So it's pretty hard not to be amped up about a young 85-win team while the division fell back.
Yeah, it's ironic too, because you could make a case that this offseason was as, I guess, a non-entity as some of the recent years where we've seen this team not really do much of anything. I mean, they did acquire Moss and they acquired Gavin Floyd, but much past that, they didn't really do anything. And I'm not trying to downgrade the Moss signing, but when we talk about quantity of movement, the Indians themselves didn't really make a lot of moves. So there is some irony there, because I think you and I both have been critical of this team in the past, not making moves, whereas this year I feel like we are just the opposite.
Absolutely. This offseason setup, and I know this isn't the way we're targeting, but one of the really challenging things about this team is you can poke it right a little bit, and you can poke it third, but in terms of improving those positions, at least their base, we have about 2+ WAR production expected from third. So to improve it, the marginal cost is actually going to be really, really high. Ultimately, I think you could have gotten Headley for his deal was a steal. And I think that, but it was still a significant cost to a small market club, and I think there wasn't really a way to upgrade right field over what you could expect from what's in AAA, or not a significant prospect cost or so. I think sneakily adding a 2+ WAR player, recovering from an injury, which has really positive recovery stories. In fact, his production was deflated a little bit trying to play through pain. So I think Moss is a little bit of a gamble, but it's a very high yield gamble. So I think the Indians came out with they had so much depth and stability at every position, and they grabbed 2 lotto tickets in Moss and Floyd that can really push them over. I liked it a lot, and I know
what they've done too, essentially, at the very least, they've acquired depth to this team, and something that we're not used to having is major league depth, and maybe almost a ridiculous amount of depth. But that's for another day. We actually are going to focus our attention more on Gavin Floyd, and the focus tonight will be the back end of that rotation, the one part of this team that has a lot of questions remaining. Is the back end of that rotation. There really aren't a lot of questions in most people's minds, Mike. There is one spot available, that number 5 spot. Once the Indians acquired Floyd, Antonetti immediately came out and guaranteed him a rotation spot. Obviously, he probably signed here based on that. A very high incentive-laden contract. He's going to make, I think, a $4 million base with a potential, Mike, to make $6 million in incentives. So we have the potential of looking at a $10 million pitcher. Before we look at the reality of the bottom end of this rotation, what are your thoughts on Gavin Floyd? I wrote a piece on him earlier this year. You mentioned him being a lottery ticket, which is a really, really good description of him. Is he somebody who you think has a legitimate shot at being a factor in this rotation long term, or did the Indians essentially purchase a guy who could maybe solidify this rotation early on and wait for some of these young guys to clear a couple of hurdles? And we'll get to those hurdles in a second. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, but ultimately, if every pitcher on your rotation makes 30 starts, which is a best case scenario, you have 10 to 12 still sitting out there. I mean, we know that's not going to be the case, especially with a guy like Floyd. So I think the Floyd signing does a couple of things in terms of service time that are important that we can get to in a minute, and he's a really good lottery ticket. Ultimately, the K right is fine. He's a little ground ball tenant, which with the infield is currently composed with Chisenhall at third and Kipnis at second, makes you a little shaky, but other parts of the staff are and will be fine. I guess I think it's a good lottery ticket. He has upside, but he's just that. You can't sell. It's hard to sell that he'll be healthy, that he'll be highly competitive, because you're just gambling.
If you look back at last year in particular with regards to Floyd, when he went down with his injury, it didn't seem all that serious. It turned out to be a real serious injury. He was really pitching well last year for Atlanta. Is this a guy that just has had dumb luck? I mean, I know he's 32 years old. This is a guy who has been successful, especially against the Indians in the past, pitching for the White Sox. Has he just been run into some bad luck, Mike? Is it possible that even at the age of 32 that these unrelated elbow injuries just kind of aren't really the trend?
I think that's got to be the gamble. On the other hand, when you're 2 years off starting 20 games, when you're 2 years separated from that, there are elbow injuries, and you're walking a pretty fine line, and there's definitive risk and definitive reward. It's just humorous that somebody who's had 2 consecutive seasons halted by arm and other physical issues is a $4 million lottery ticket, which kind of speaks to the cost of starting pitching and why the assimilation of talent that the Indians have and the cost that they're paying them is just absolutely incredible and poises them to contend for a long, long time.
Yeah, well, this olecranon bone or whatever it's called that he broke, it ended Joel Zamaya's career. I don't know. We'll see. When we talk about Salazar here in a second, perhaps their signing of Floyd may speak more to him as far as control goes, and when Danny Salazar might really be ready this year, as opposed to anything else. But let's go ahead and talk about the real battles. That number 5 battle. There's really 4 guys, Mike, being mentioned for that. We've got Zach McAllister, Josh Tomlin, Danny Salazar, and TJ House. You've written about 2 of these guys already. We'll get to them in a second. But is it okay? This might just be me, but I'm pretty ready to put an end to the Josh Tomlin talk. Can we just get rid of him right now?
Yeah, he's gone. We'll toss him aside. He's a good middle reliever.
Yeah, I guess he's a good middle reliever.
Good mom.
He had that string of 6 inning, that 6-inning run. Remember that? That was him, right? I can't even tell anymore. It's like 5 years ago, it seems like. All right, well, let's start with McAllister. I wrote about McAllister in December. He's an interesting guy, Mike. We talked about this in a podcast last year. He, out of nowhere, started touching 98. This is a guy who, when we talked about Zach McAllister in the past, velocity was not one of those pieces. And this is a guy who, actually, I don't think he touched 98, but I think he was hovering right around it. Did the velocity might come from him being able to just come in late in games and throw short periods of time, or is there some sort of relationship between tweaking pitches? It really seems like he's turned himself into something else. Is this a relief thing, or is this something we could see from McAllister? Should he be a starter? Should he somehow earn his way as the number 5 guy?
Yeah, I think there's a definite mix of both. Because if you look at his 2013 velocity data, he's someone who sat between basically around 91 or 92. And even last year when he was in the starting rotation, his average fastball velocity was between 93 and 94. So there was a velo leap even when he was in the starting rotation last year, but then we see the spike when he's in the bullpen. I think the bullpen really adds that ability to reach back. And ultimately, though his fastball velocity is solid, the issue for McAllister has always been secondary offerings. Can he play anything off the fastball? And he's never really had a solid secondary offering. So him being able to push the fastball a little more and be less dangerous the second and third time through the order when he has less to play with and be deceptive with is really important. I think on other teams, if we hadn't signed Floyd, McAllister would be really important to keeping stretched out or at least prepared to be that next starter to step in. But the ability to kind of transfer him to the back end where he can average 95, 96 miles per hour, push it up 97, 98, I think that's absolutely huge, and I think he could make a really sneaky good bookend with Cody Allen pitching in high leverage situations.
Well, and let's get down to business. I mean, when you talk about the semantics of baseball, McAllister has no options left. You and I both know if they DFA him, he's not sneaking through anyone. I mean, there's got to be a lot of teams looking at him as the potential steal should the Indians try to slide him through. This is a guy who's going to be one of the Indians' 13 pitchers this year. And if he doesn't make the rotation, it doesn't look like he's going to, just based on the guys that we're about to talk about. He's a lock to be in this bullpen, right? I mean, we're not going to have someone sneak up on him and knock him off this team, are we?
No chance.
Yeah, so I find it interesting that the Indians haven't made any big major moves in the bullpen, and it seems like maybe their big move in the bullpen is Zach McAllister. Do you see him being a guy who can close games? Or are you seeing him being another? They talk a lot about, you and I have talked about in 100 podcasts about high leverage relievers and how Cody Allen really is the epitome of that. Is McAllister the kind of guy who can live in the 7, 8, 9? Perhaps add some life to Brian Shaw, who died at the end of the year last year. Could this trio, adding in even a guy like Nick Hagedorn, could these four guys be played around with in the 7, 8, and 9 and really keep this bullpen going strong into September, where we saw this bullpen really kind of die out late last year?
Absolutely, and I think one of the things we really look at in high leverage situations is the ability to avoid contact. That is, a lot of high leverage situations we see are runners in scoring position where any contact increases the likelihood of run scoring, especially in fluky small sample sizes. So what we saw with McAllister last year was a guy who usually had a K per 9 around 6 to 7, was flashing 8.5, 9 in the bullpen role. So he has an ability to miss bats, to limit contact, which is really, really essential, especially in a high leverage situation. So absolutely, I think he could be an asset back there, closing, non-closing. I think Tito's finally getting to that point where I think he really understands the nature of high leverage and the fact that using Allen in the 8th may be really important rather than the 9th. Using Allen in the 7th may be really important, which is it's an outstanding step to see a manager take, even if Tito seems to reject every other notion we have of acting efficiently.
Yeah, well, and I think that's been one of the frustrating things we've had to put up with over the 2 years with Tito is kind of how he's handled some of these guys, and he does play some buddy ball with some of these guys. It does seem like he's trying to put in place a quality bullpen. We'll see. We got some young guys coming up too. We'll get into the bullpen later in the year, but let's talk about the matter at hand. We likely will see Z-Mac in that bullpen, and Josh Tomlin's likely out of the equation. If Gavin Floyd's number 4, really the battle comes down to two guys. Those two guys are guys that we love here at EverybodyHatesCleveland.com, and that's Danny Salazar, who's essentially been our rallying flag over the past 2 years here, as well as TJ House, who is another favorite. Before we get into these two guys, do you have a favorite in the race right now? If you were a betting man today on February 9:30 p.m., who do you think is going to be the 5th starter? We'll get into the semantics of why in a second. Who do you think is going to be the guy coming out of spring training?
I'd bet on TJ House.
And who would have thought at the beginning of last year that we'll be talking about TJ House potentially beating out Danny Salazar for that number 5 slot. As kind of a segue here before we start talking about House, I do agree with you, Mike, and I talked a little bit about that yesterday in my piece. But Mike had a really nice piece on TJ House, paying particular attention to why TJ House can be an effective starter for the Cleveland Indians and how he fits in progressive field. Make sure you check it out, www.everybodyhatescleveland.com. It's the headliner today, at least until 12:01. We got another big story coming up, and we'll talk about that story in a second. But Mike, let's before we get into TJ House and some people who are listening who may not have been paying attention over the off season or really paying attention at the tail end of that last season. TJ House has emerged as kind of a guy to talk about, and a lot more than just because he's a left-hander. We'll get into him in a second. Let's talk Danny Salazar. Are you picking TJ House because you're concerned about Salazar? Why do you think Salazar is not the guy? I mean, this is a guy who came in a year and a half ago throwing 100 miles an hour. This is a guy who wiped out Miguel Cabrera, struck him out 3 straight times. Obviously has a lot of really good stuff. He struggled a bit last year out of the gate, looked a lot better as the year progressed, got sent down, bounced back and forth a little bit, but of course solidified himself as the year progressed. Was the guy who pitched in the wild card game in that game against Tampa. They lost, but he didn't really pitch all that badly. What are you out of favor with Danny Salazar, or is there something else behind this?
Yeah, thanks for setting me up to say that. Despite the accusations, I will never be out of favor with Danny Salazar, the pitcher. I think.
Let's keep it on the field today. Let's keep it on the field. We don't want to, there's no charges being brought, so I want to stay away from that stuff for now. I'm so sick of Cleveland being about off-the-field stories, and good Lord, we got enough of that. So for now, we'll say, no harm, no foul.
So Salazar, just a quick note. Awesome stuff. We love it, right? He's got a plus fastball, no matter what anybody says. He is probably one of the 5 best changeups in Major League Baseball. Off those 2 pitches alone, he's a 3 or 4 starter, and there's not a team other than the Washington Nationals that wouldn't have him in rotation to start the season. So a couple of things about Salazar, just because I have to get them off my mind. The first is that infield fly ball percentage, and this is an actual skill, and it's important. It's important because it's a pop-up, and pop-ups have about the same execution or out percentage as a strikeout does. So Danny Salazar is an incredible strikeout pitcher and induces a lot of infield fly balls, which limits the amount of balls in play of the dangerous variety that he has. So actually, when we look at all these outlying statistics, we see somebody that has been a really solid Major League pitcher, and all the indicators are that he's been incredibly unlucky in his sample. The last bit is whether the slider can get better, but I think really Salazar is going to be starting in AAA for a couple of different reasons, one of which is his control clock. And his clock is really weird because it seems like we've been seeing Danny Salazar for a while now, even though he burst onto the scene. But if they can kind of stall it out till May, it may protect another year of Danny Salazar, which if you can have Danny Salazar through your age 31 season, that's awesome. So I think that's absolutely huge. That's a huge part of it. And the last is, one of the criticisms of Salazar last year is that he came into the season slowly because he's never really rushed in a Major League season. Mickey Callaway's talked about at different points that Salazar just wasn't prepared to go when the season started in the big leagues. And I know they want to push him so that he is ready, but my temptation is that they know he's going to get 25 starts either way. Why not try and protect his clock if you can and have him ready when he starts?
Well, and this is where Gavin Floyd comes into play. You talked about him being a lottery ticket. Could this be the reason for the lottery ticket? He has he appears to be healthy. I mean, could they be looking at Gavin Floyd as a guy who, worst case scenario, lasts a month or two, which would get Danny Salazar to that clock spot that you were talking about? And could this be? Could they be looking at a potential piggyback situation? Also, keeping in mind that injuries happen, and If something else happens, Salazar comes up. And let's be clear here, Mike. If Salazar has a wipeout spring, he's going to make this rotation, isn't he? All
Yeah.
things being equal. I mean, if Danny Salazar is Danny Salazar this spring, as much as we like TJ House, there's really not a whole lot House can do. I mean, Salazar's that good, right?
Absolutely. I think either of these guys, and at the end of the day, I would expect that both of these guys get 22 to 25 starts at least. So ultimately we're kind of picking at, who's there on opening day versus who's pitching important games in August is pretty small, but it's still important in the grand scheme of things. So I think you see both of them, getting large, and the way Salazar can pitch, you can very easily see a way if he's prepared, if he's ready to go, that he just forces his way in. He's filthy in many ways, and you got to get him in the rotation.
Well, I guess I think a thing that I've been interested in over the past couple of years, especially with the emergence of Corey Kluber and Carlos Carrasco, and I talked a little bit about this on Sunday. It seems as though Callaway has this way about him in the offseason of slow burning. Kind of his, I guess, best way to put it is his teachings on these guys. If you go back 2 years to Ubaldo Jimenez, who he worked with over the offseason, and we could slowly see throughout the year these little mechanical things kind of fix themselves until he had that fantastic final 2 months. Corey Kluber, kind of a similar story, although much quicker improvement, where both Ruben Niebla and Callaway worked with him in the offseason, and literally on a dime he seemed to improve. Could Salazar be on the same path? I mean, could this be a scenario where they're working with him on his slider and on his secondary offerings, and we could see as the year progresses that third pitch turn into something special for I don't want to go that far, but something a little more effective? Could we see them working on a secondary pitch for Salazar that comes to fruition sometime in July or August?
Absolutely. If he can get that slider to somewhere average or tick below above, or if he has that curveball that he adds, or a slurve to kind of get there to that third pitch being average, he's dominant against left-handed hitters, and he's pretty mediocre against right-handed hitters. And if he can just get to a little above average against right-handed hitters and eat up lefties, and he's a front-end guy. That's absolutely, I think that's definitely proof. And I think one of the other really interesting things, while we can discuss Callaway here, is that one of the troubles is that it's really hard for us to establish value on how managers can actually affect the game and how coaching can. But if we've noticed anything, it's that there's a significant effect that Callaway can have on rotation and putting it in place. And I think if you can ever make a case for someone making a manager's salary as a positional coach, it's got to be Mickey Callaway. That's just a side.
Well, there's something odd there, because when your bullpen coach gets a head coaching, when Cash gets a job, and you don't even get a sniff at Callaway, who's developed, and you could argue Kluber, you could argue Carrasco, you can argue Jimenez, and got the Salazar project going. It seems odd to me that Callaway hasn't even gotten a sniff. He hasn't even been mentioned as a potential managerial candidate. Doesn't that seem odd to you?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the matter at hand. And you wrote a really nice piece on TJ House today, and I've got one coming up in the coming weeks, just kind of talking about his development over the years. I've been watching him, Mike, for the past couple of years, and well, really for 4 years I got to watch him toil in the minors. This is a guy who they drafted a little later than a lot of people thought, but had some good velocity, struggled a bit, and then revitalized himself after the 2012 minor league season, and has really picked up steam over the years, and really came out of nowhere last year. This guy has gone from not being an equation to being a guy who might make the rotation, Mike, because he's a lefty, to now just being one of their top 5 pitchers. Talk to me a little bit about ballpark factor, Mike. This was something that you've really been interested in over the past couple of years. You talk a little bit about that today, specifically about TJ House. Why is Progressive Field, and why could the Cleveland Indians be just the perfect place for him to be playing in 2015?
Yeah, I think baseball is really interesting because we think of it in a highly individualistic sense, which is really important because in many ways it is an individual performance in a collective atmosphere. Um, but when I talk about park factor a little bit, it's a lot like talking about floor spacing in basketball. I am finding the correct fit to create nice floor spacing. In terms of finding the correct player to fit a perfect time, and I think what happens at Progressive is, visually you can just notice that the fence from the left field foul pole to center field, it's really elevated. It's called the Little Monster, but it has a significant effect on right-handed power. Also, as an addendum, that's why the Indians haven't produced a lot of right-handed power over the past 10, 15 years, if you noticed, and why Manny Ramirez was extra special, and so was Albert Bell. That's something else. But what you look at is that it highly suppresses home runs. So park factor for home runs for right-handed hitters is 93. Neutral is 100. Pitcher friendly is below 100. There are only 5 parks in Major League Baseball that are less positive or more suppressing of right-handed power than Jacobs Field, Progressive Field. So I think that's really important to note. The second is that House drives a lot of ground balls because of his fastball slider combo. There's a lot of solid movement on a two-seamer that he throws. So he gets a lot of ground balls, which ground balls obviously don't give up extra base hits, and hitting home runs in Progressive Field as a right-handed hitter is very rare, and he draws a lot of right-handed hitters because he's a left-handed pitcher. So, ultimately, it's pretty limiting of slugging his pitcher profile. So if he can control walks, not give a lot of extra free base runners, which is something that's gradually improving, you can talk about his improvement in that direction. He can control his walk rate. The park sets up really well. And then if you have Lindor at short and Ramirez getting a lot of playing time between second and third, or just Ramirez at short, you have a really solid defensive infield for his ground ball tendon skill set. So I think House is a really solid fit. He's got better stuff than people think. And you can't miss with either of these two.
Yeah, well, whenever you mention lefties in the Indians organization, you immediately start thinking of guys like Aaron Laffey and these soft-tossing left-handed guys who max out at 92. He's not a guy who maxes out at 92. This is a guy who can hit 95. His fastball has good velocity, good movement. What happened after 2012 is he got fit. I mean, you can read more about this in a couple weeks as I talk a little bit about how he changed kind of his off-season regimen. I took that more seriously, but this is a guy who's now a student of the game. We talk a lot about Michael Brantley studying to be a better hitter and how that has, we've seen that. We called this 2 years ago. We saw him improve over the past 2 years. TJ House is I guess the best way to say it. You could make a case that he's the Michael Brantley of this rotation. This is a guy who does his homework. This is a guy who comes in ready to pitch. He's earned his way into this rotation, and he's got more than people give him credit for. You made a great comment the other day about him not being a lefty, him just being a really good pitcher, and that's just the way it is. But like anything else, Mike, body of work's important. Do you think he's got the type of IQ? Do you think that he's got the type of work ethic to overcome what inevitably happens to all these young guys, these major league hitters doing their homework on him? Is his stuff good enough to overcome the rubber band snap that we usually get with these major league hitters starting to figure these guys out?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think he'll easily adjust. I think he has a solid 3-pitch mix. You can speak to his IQ a little bit. And one of the really interesting things that's nice is that Jeremy Sowers was a really smart guy. I mean, he had a really nice IQ. He was a Vanderbilt grad. I mean, he was really smart, but he couldn't push it up to 94 when he needed to. He didn't have a plus slider that he could rely on. And TJ House does, and so he's smart. He prepares well, and he has solid stuff, and he's a good fit. So I think his floor is a rotation member, and I think his ceiling is pretty nice.
Well, if TJ House is a guy who's living in 3-4-5 over the next 5 years, I think I'd be pretty okay with that. Again, he's a guy, you love stories like this, and you got to give the Indians credit. You got to give TJ House credit. This is a guy who really 2 years in high A, Mike. This guy was lost. This guy had a 5+ ERA, could barely get out of the fourth inning in most of his starts in his last full season at High A at Kinston. They moved to Carolina, and this guy immediately became a guy you knew who was going to leave Carolina quickly, and he did. He moved up to Akron, the following year up to Columbus, and now he's a guy who's likely going to get that number 5 slot. The funny thing is, Mike, if he doesn't win that slot, I don't think Salazar wins the slot either. This is where a guy like McAllister to me becomes interesting, because without options, I could see a scenario where they're both pitching. You got T.J. House and you've got Zach McAllister pitching evenly. I could see a situation where McAllister is that number 5 guy. Do you think that if everything's equal, do you think McAllister could be the number 5 guy? Remember, McAllister's a guy who's been in this rotation. This was 3 years. This isn't some rookie. And Francona seems to like these veteran guys. I mean, could this be the deciding factor? I mean, if all things are equal, is Zach McAllister back in the equation again? That's where this gets fun, man. This is fun. We got depth, legit depth.
Isn't that fun? That doesn't sound fun to me. That sounds like something that would frustrate me about Francona, which makes it likely.
It's frustrating if TJ
it's very possible. For me, there's a 3% likelihood, 3 to 5% likelihood that Zach McAllister backs into the spot, but they involve an injury to one of those two and bad performance from the other. If I was doing the Francona meter likelihood of Zach McAllister getting the spot, it's probably closer to 10 to 12%, but it's not very high. So I think it has to be decided between the two, and I trust that the powers that be will make that very clear.
Well, I think the fun thing about this rotation as we start to wrap things up is I think the Indians have shown over the past 3 years under this regime, especially with Callaway and with Terry Francona, is that they don't really look at the spring as a competition necessarily. What they seem to try to do, Mike, and I don't want to get too much into this. If you want to read more about this, check out my Sunday Drive from yesterday. But it does seem like that what they do is they try to build a solid unit of guys who can start in the rotation. If you look at the past 2 seasons, last year in particular, that the team last year was very interesting starting-wise because, Mike, they were one of the top 10 rotations in baseball, and of course you can argue about the semantics of that, but this is a team that literally had 8 starters play significant roles in this rotation. Terry Francona said something 2 years ago when talking about Scott Kazmir that just rings true to me year after year after year. Does he really look at March as a battle, or does he look at March as a way to create this really 8 or 9 man deep rotation that he can shuffle in and out as the year progresses, understanding that some of these guys, especially a guy like Gavin Floyd, are going to deal with injuries? I mean, look back at 2013. We dealt in 2013, Mike, we had Zach McAllister miss 6 weeks, we had Corey Kluber miss 6 weeks, and we had Justin Masterson miss a month. And that rotation, month to month to month, was led by somebody else, including the emergence of Corey Kluber and Ubaldo Jimenez earning a 4-year, $50 million contract. Has Terry Francona and Mickey Callaway created this such a team mentality that they legitimately could have an 8-man deep rotation? I mean, if you look at last year's statistics, I mean, we're looking again. I think we had, what was it, Mike, 8 guys with 12 to 14 plus starts?
Yeah. I think during the offseason, Ed Carroll, if you follow him at all on Twitter, has just been saying whenever you talk about what the Indians need to do in free agency, it's more pitching. And I think it really speaks to how you develop rotational depth. And you are going to see 7 guys with 20 starts this year, at least 15, and that's just the way Major League Baseball is. You have attrition, and there are significant issues there. So I think they are 70. I think in an era where run prevention is becoming more and more essential to creating a positive run differential, where run scoring is extremely suppressed, the Indians are situated really, really well. I think Floyd can be solid. McAllister or Tomlin as a fifth guy when the front four are really strong don't hurt you very much when they're solid. So I think it sets up really well. They can shuffle a little bit, and who knows if maybe Cody Anderson makes a leap that we care about. I don't love the odds of that happening,
You
but
do
there are a
have some
couple of guys.
interesting names, though. Merritt's down there, the organizational pitcher of the year. He's an interesting look. Hiram's buddy, Sean Moramondo's down there making waves. That Charlie Brewer they picked up. They do have some interesting guys down there with some good stuff. This is just an interesting organization right now. We got some depth, and as we kind of close up shop, you mentioned Ed Carroll. I'm not gonna steal anyone's thunder, but Mike, I'm gonna let you have first dibs at this as we wrap things up. The rotation looks to be fairly solid. We'll be back either tomorrow or in the next couple days talking about the front end of this rotation, the likelihood of Corey Kluber reclaiming a Cy Young or making a run for that. Is Carlos Carrasco really his equal, or will he regress? And then we'll look at perhaps the most interesting guy in this rotation, a guy that has that IQ, and that's Trevor Bauer. With so much attention on a lot of other people, people forget the pedigree that Trevor Bauer has. And he made strides last year, Mike, that are so interesting to me because he became a pretty good pitcher. Not a great pitcher, but a pretty good pitcher. And we all know the kind of stuff he has. He'll be fun to talk about, don't you think? This kid could be a surprise. I don't want to get too much into it, but I know you're a Bauer fan. Do you think that Bauer's a forgotten guy, and is that a good thing?
Yeah, I don't want to dive in this too much, but I think it's a great thing. If you have a guy who throws 94, 95, tops out there, maybe a little higher, and has a plus curveball, and is really stinking smart, and is younger than 25, I'm going to bet on him all the time, and that's Trevor Bauer. So he's set up to make a nice leap while none of us pay attention to him.
Yeah, we'll talk a lot about Trevor Bauer on our next podcast. Mike, make a plug. I know there's a lot of different directions you can go. The floor is yours, my friend. Anything to plug tonight? And rumor has it we got something big coming up tonight.
Yeah, there's a really, really strong piece written about kind of the disconnect between sabermetrics and reality a little bit, and how it relates to Jason Giambi's experience with the Cleveland Indians. And it's an absolutely tremendous read. I peeked at it a little bit, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. So take a look out for that. Read Jim's Sunday piece about the entire rotation. Take a peek at my thoughts on TJ House. See if they make any sense. And just look for what's next.
Yeah, this is the week where you look at look for what's next. I'm going to give you a couple of those what's next here in a second. My big plug is the hidden gem of our site. That's Michael Hattery, who's been writing up a storm. This kid got married 2 months ago, and now he's writing like crazy, living there in his new apartment in New York. But in my opinion, wrote his best piece about Danny Salazar. This piece about House was tremendous. There's a lot of good stuff, and rumor has it, Mike, you've been rambling on and on about Zach Walters. I hear a rumor that you might have a Walters piece coming up soon. Is this true?
It's true. Lots of gifts. I promise lots of gifts.
All right, we're going to wrap things up. My final plug here. You heard Mike mention a great piece on Giambi, which is ironic because Mike and I got into battles about Giambi a couple of years ago. Every time Mike would slam Giambi, he would hit a home run. It seems like just yesterday. I got to tell you, Mike, we got some big things in the works, and I'm just going to share one of those. You mentioned Ed Carroll. He's the one who wrote that Giambi piece. So if you're listening live, we've borrowed Ed Carroll for Wahoo's on First. He's now a correspondent here at Everybody Hates Cleveland, and you'll be seeing quite a bit of him over the coming weeks, months, years, days. We're really excited to have Ed aboard. He's the first of a volley of several writers that you've all seen before. I'm going to hold off on talking about those. I know Mike and I and probably Steve Urbanek will be potting in the next day or two. We'll share our next little surprise for you for that podcast. But check it out, midnight tonight. Ed Carroll writing his first piece for EverybodyHatesCleveland.com. Make sure you check it out. We've got other surprises for you. Of course, I've got my corner piece coming up on Wednesday, and Mike's working on his piece. I don't know if that'll be up on Thursday or a different day, but we definitely have a full boat, and we do have another surprise author coming up on Friday that I know about for sure, with a lot of potential in between. This is our soft launch. We've soft launched many times before, but for those of you not taking EverybodyHatesCleveland.com seriously as a site you want to check out every day, trust me on this. You're about to see some names you've seen in the past. These are names that I've respected for many, many years and who really can write about Cleveland sports. EverybodyHatesCleveland.com is not a site trying to compete. It's just a site trying to put out some really good content. We still check out WFNY. We still check IBI. We still check all of the other sites that are out there. Let's Go Tribe, Real Cavs fans. These are all great sites. Check them out. We're not trying to steal their thunder. We're just trying to fill in the glue and mesh everything together with some really good editorial. So make sure you check us out, EverybodyHatesCleveland.com. I promise you, if Ed Carroll's a big enough get, and it's just the start, I promise you, we've got not one, not two, not three. That's right, I'm pulling a LeBron. Not four, not five, not even six. We got even more than that, and it's going to be on a daily basis over the next 2 or 3 weeks, and this is something you're going to see pretty steady over the next year. So make sure you join us at EHC. We got some big things coming for you, and of course, we got the old stalwarts here as well. If you want to read some ramblings, you've got my stuff up once or twice a week, Steve Orbanik stuff once or twice a week, and of course the hidden gem here, Mike Hattery. We've got Rich Primo still writing pieces, and we got a ton of pop culture stuff. This is a site that's going to grow in leaps and bounds. Mike, I don't know that I can say anything more than that. That was a lot of plugs. My throat's starting to hurt.
Yeah, that was a tiring plug. That was a lot of plug.
20 to 40, but yeah, well worth it. So check us out. Eddie Carroll, welcome to the club, my friend. Go Cleveland.